Welcome to the deep dive, where we tear into foundational knowledge so you can get smart fast. Today, we're taking a deep breath and diving into a book that really shaped modern software architecture, design patterns, elements of reusable object-oriented software. But we aren't starting at chapter one. We are going straight to the conclusion. That's where you often find the biggest, most, profound philosophical lessons about design itself.
It's an essential move, I think. The conclusion, which is just titled Conclusion, it directly tackles the biggest criticism the authors knew they'd face.
Which was what?
That they didn't really invent anything new, that they hadn't proposed some new algorithm or a rigid formal method. They just, documented designs that were already out there.
Right. And the genius of this chapter is how they pivot. They basically say, yeah, you're right. But then they show why that act, just documenting and cataloging, taking this vague expert intuition and giving it a name, is the truly revolutionary part.
And that's our mission today. We want to explore those 4 critical impacts that cataloging has on how designers communicate, learn, and ultimately build systems that last. We're talking about moving design from this private talent to public discussable knowledge.
Okay, so let's start with the most immediate impact they talk about, this idea of a common vocabulary. I mean, if these patterns already existed, why is just naming them so powerful? Isn't that just adding more jargon?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how experts think. They don't process things purely in code syntax, right? They organize knowledge into these bigger conceptual chunks. Think about data structures. You don't describe a linked list node by node every single time.
No, you just say linked list.
You just say linked list, and everyone knows what you mean. So when a designer looks at a big system, they're not just seeing individual bits of polymorphism and delegation. They're seeing a whole conceptual structure.
Okay, so when you name a pattern, you're naming one of those high-level structures.
Precisely. This common vocabulary, it just immediately raises the level of abstraction. Look, if I have to describe how one object needs to tell a bunch of other objects when its state changes, I have to talk about registration, iteration, update methods. It's like 10 lines of explanation.
But if you just use the pattern name,
I just say, we need an observer pattern here. That one word observer, it encapsulates the whole thing, the structure, the intent, the trade-offs. It cuts down the apparent complexity of the system, because we can talk about relationships and roles, not just primitive code interactions.
that immediately leads into their second major impact, which is all about documentation and learning. I remember the source material talking about how tough it is for novices to just look at a massive code base and, figure out the design.
Oh, it's the core problem. A novice looks at a big, mature, object-oriented system, and they just complain. They say the class hierarchies are convoluted, the control flow is all over the place, the inheritance is a mess.
And the author's point is that a lot of that confusion is just because the novice doesn't recognize the patterns underneath it all.
Exactly. It's not that the code is bad. It's that the novice doesn't have the conceptual map to read it. They see all these complex interactions, but they don't see, oh, that's a strategy pattern, or that's a decorator.
So the patterns act as a kind of intellectual shortcut.
A vital one. And it has this dual function. First, if you recognize the patterns in existing code, you overcome that initial confusion. You immediately grasp the intent. You don't have to spend all this time reverse engineering the structure just to figure out what the original designer was trying to do.
And the second part of that.
The second part is, if you learn the patterns before you start coding, you just accelerate your own expertise. Sure, you might discover these solutions on your own after years of trial and error, but learning the catalog helps you act more like an expert much, much faster. It's a library of proven solutions.
It's common problems, right?
Exactly. Instead of spending a week trying to figure out how to elegantly swap out behaviors in a system, you learn the strategy pattern and you think, okay, I need to find a family of algorithms, encapsulate each one, and make them interchangeable. That's a huge leap.
Which brings us to the third critical impact, how patterns work as this essential adjunct to existing design methods. Because the traditional methods, all the notations, the boxes and arrows, they're great for defining the notation, but they often lack the experience, wisdom.
The methods tell you what notation to use, but the patterns tell you the how and the why of the actual design decisions. They show you how to use primitives like inheritance and polymorphism to achieve specific goals, like, say, parameterizing a system with an algorithm or a state.
And the book highlights this critical gap that patterns bridge, this messy transition between the analysis model and the flexible implementation model. Could you define those two for us really quickly?
Of course. So the analysis model, that's usually your first step. It's describing the objects and concepts from the real-world problem. It's focused on what the system needs to do. But when you move to the implementation model, you're shifting your focus to how. How does the software need to be built to be flexible, reusable, and maintainable down the line?
And that transition is inherently messy, isn't it?
Extremely. An analysis model that's just focused on real-world objects, it often doesn't account for what you need for flexibility like handling variations in behavior or configuring the system on the fly. To make a system reusable, you often have to introduce new classes that weren't even in your original analysis.
So the pattern descriptions with their sections on applicability, consequences, and implementation, they're basically the missing recipe book to get you through that messy gap.
That's a perfect way to put it. They explicitly guide your decisions. They tell you when to use object composition instead of inheritance, when to introduce an abstract class, and why you would accept one trade-off over another.
This idea of inherent flexibility leads us right to the fourth and maybe the most philosophical impact patterns as a target for refactoring, because software inevitably evolves and that evolution is, well, it's often painful.
It is unavoidable.
Yeah.
The authors cite Brian Foote's 3 phases of object-oriented software evolution. First is prototyping, rapid changes, early days. The software is adolescent and really focused on white box reuse.
And white box reuse, that's basically reuse through inheritance, right? Where the child class knows all about the parent's internal structure.
Correct. But if you lean on that too heavily for too long, you hit the second phase, the expansionary phase, where new requirements come in. And that phase eventually just stalls because the class hierarchies become, as they put it, too inflexible and arthritic for more changes. The structure is just reflecting too many different problems.
Sounds like technical debt personified.
It is. And that leads to the third phase, the consolidating phase. This is where you need massive refactoring. This is the heavy lifting, tearing classes apart, moving responsibilities, rationalizing interfaces. And crucially, this is where you shift away from that brittle white box reuse and toward black box reuse with object composition.
Okay, let's pause there because that distinction feels really important. Why is black box reuse with composition so much more robust and less arthritic than white box reuse with inheritance?
It's all about decoupling. White box reuse exposes all the implementation details. So if the base class changes, every single subclass might break. That's the famous fragile base class problem. Black box reuse, on the other hand, it relies on stable interfaces. You interact with another object through its contract, its public API, not by knowing its internal secrets.
So you compose objects together, and since you're just relying on that stable interface, changes inside one object are way less likely to cascade out and break the whole system.
Exactly. So the goal of a successful refactoring effort is to move toward these decoupled composed structures.
Which means that the patterns are the destination.
They are the target. Patterns capture those robust black box structures that experts arrive at after a successful refactoring. They embody the wisdom of how to build flexibility in from the start. And here's the huge takeaway. If you use these patterns early in the design, you often prevent those incredibly costly, painful refactorings later on. You've already built the flexible target structure.
That is a huge insight into software longevity. Wow. Okay, let's step back and look at the history of the book itself for a second. These patterns weren't just delivered perfectly formed, were they?
Not at all. That evolutionary process is critical to understand. The whole catalog started in Eric Gemma's PhD thesis. And the authors say the easy part was spotting the patterns. They saw them again and again in different systems. The incredibly hard part was describing them so that someone who hadn't used one could understand its value and know when to choose it.
They even mentioned that some of the names changed, which I find fascinating. Wrapper became decorator, glue became facade.
Right, but the biggest change was in the description format itself. They started with these really short, maybe 2-page descriptions, and they realized it just wasn't enough. Designers weren't really grasping the trade-offs, so they expanded them dramatically to 10 or more pages, adding detailed examples, implementation notes, and most importantly, they put a much bigger emphasis on describing the problem that the pattern solves, the why.
So instead of just leading with, here's the structure for factory method, they started with the problem, like, when should a class let its subclasses decide which objects to create?
Exactly. Knowing the solution is one thing. Understanding the problem domain where that solution is the best choice, that's the mark of an expert. They had to teach the context.
This whole idea of documenting expertise connects directly to the book's biggest influence, the work of Christopher Alexander on architectural design patterns.
Yes, Alexander's work was the direct philosophical inspiration. And you can see the similarities clearly. Both observe successful existing systems. They both use natural language. They both provide a rationale, the why.
But the authors are also very quick to point out some crucial differences between what they did and what Alexander was doing for architecture.
Absolutely. Three major distinctions. First, the scope. Alexander was drawing on thousands of years of architectural history. Software design is, a baby by comparison, just a few decades old. Second, Alexander suggests a very specific order for using his patterns to generate a whole system. The Design Patterns book. It doesn't do that. It doesn't prescribe an order.
And the third difference, which I think is maybe the most important and humbling one,
Is that Alexander claimed his patterns, when used correctly, could generate complete buildings. The software authors, they make no such claim. They are very clear that their patterns do not generate complete programs.
they're realistic.
They are. They clarify that their book is a collection of related patterns. It's not a complete pattern language for all of software. A true complete language would need analysis patterns, UI patterns, framework-specific patterns. This book is a vital piece, but it's not the whole story.
And we see that same effort to catalog expertise everywhere. They mentioned Donald Knuth's work on algorithms, which is at a totally different level of abstraction, and James Copland's work on C++ idioms, which are more like lower-level patterns.
Right, and it all reinforces this shared goal. To get technical expertise out of individual heads and into a shared, accessible body of knowledge. The whole point is to move design decisions out of this realm of vague intuition and into structured, repeatable, discussable engineering.
So if we bring it all home, the immense value of this book, and especially this conclusion, is that it gives us that high-level language and the proven structures we need to build systems that can actually survive, that can survive that inevitable, painful cycle of expansion and refactoring. They basically gave us the blueprints for survival.
They gave the community a shared tool for recognizing and repairing complexity. And the authors, they invite you, the listener, the designer, to use these patterns, to embrace the vocabulary, and critically, to become a critical consumer. Use them, test them, provide feedback so the catalog keeps evolving.
That's a fantastic invitation, and it's a powerful way to end this deep dive. So here is the final thought for you to consider. The software lifecycle inevitably, always, demands refactoring to correct bad design and move toward that better black box reuse. So if using patterns helps prevent that later rework, how much accumulated technical debt that inflexible and arthritic design could be avoided if every novice just learned to think in patterns from day one? The patterns don't just solve today's problems. They ensure a system's long-term survival.
That knowledge really is the best insurance policy against architectural decay. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.